You're listening to the Bahá'í World News Service.
In this episode, we hear from representatives of the Bahá'í international community as they examine social barriers to achieving equality between women and men. They share insights from Bahá'í efforts that are fostering progress by challenging conventional thinking about roles, leadership, and the spiritual foundations of true equality. We hear from Shamona Munilal from the Addis Abeba office.
More and more as we include men, then this collective learning process just becomes stronger.
Bani Dugal from the New York office.
Of course, it's a very slow process. It's an organic process, but it's really trying to change the way we are wired to think about each other.
Hatem El-Hadi from the Cairo office.
Men and women come together to learn about how to advance our spiritual and material needs in the communities.
And Rochelle Bayani from the Brussels office.
It isn't just for them to then come to the table to participate in something existing, but really think together with others about how this whole society we're in can look different.
From the Bahá'í World News Service, this is In Conversation, a podcast series that explores experiences from Bahá'í efforts to contribute to social progress, from the grassroots to the international level.
I'm so happy we are here to talk about an issue which is dear to my heart, and that is that of the advancement of women and men and gender equality and the advancement of women and girls. And in all the years that, well, pretty much all my life, I've experienced this issue, even as a young girl growing up in India. No matter if you're educated or come from privilege or not, the inequality that women and girls face is very much something that one is conscious of. But I think by many measures in the past 50 years or so, we've seen an advancement in the status of women and girls. There have been great normative strides, especially since the many conferences. There have been 4 major conferences on women, UN conferences. And so you have these legal standards and normative standards that have been put in place by governments. And then we also have levels of education. We are seeing more and more women being educated around the world and working in professional spheres and in leadership roles, and there's a great deal of advance. But on the flip side, we are seeing a pushback of sorts. Even in countries where we see a lot of what one would say is equality, we are seeing a rise in violence against women, for instance. And this epidemic of violence against women can be seen across the globe. And that's only one. I mean, there are other, there's hate speech, gender-based hate speech, and we're seeing lots of tendencies in some parts of the world. And Shamona, you're a young woman. What was your experience like?
So in Africa, from what I've observed from growing up in the continent, is that the entrenched views of women have opened the doors to gender-based violence. Views such as women are seen as vulnerable or weak in nature. And these have been perpetuated by customs and cultural practices. And one can see its systemic impact on governance, food security, and education. And as we know, there's rural settings and urban settings in Africa where gender equality finds expression. In the rural settings, it's the traditional practices that have perpetuated or made gender inequality exacerbated. In the urban settings, from what I've observed, is although women are formally educated, they may be in leadership positions, there are certain assumptions about them that have led to their mistreatment, which I'm sure is also quite a global characteristic. Certain assumptions that are being made about women and their capacity. And I'm sure both in Europe and in the Arab region, that also exists.
It's also interesting to think about what we usually mean by participation and how the word is usually used and what do we understand by it. And often when we say participation, we actually mean simply an equal number of whether it's women or this or that kind of population sitting around the table together. And I think the idea, we believe, is how can they participate in reimagining the society we have today? So it isn't just for them to then come to the table to participate in something existing, but really think together with others about how this whole society we're in can look different. And probably until that doesn't happen, it will be very difficult to move away from some existing patterns or even assumptions people have about women.
Yes, it's very true. There's lots of assumptions that are there for various reasons, whether it's cultural, historical, sometimes even religious interpretations that have, unfortunately, have not given women the status that is really befitting of the nobility of a human being. And I think that aspect of recognition of the nobility of the human being, which is our primary identity, needs to really supersede any other recognition of secondary identities. And therefore, I think one of the challenges that we see, for example, in the Arab world is how do we really make this a subject of inquiry? How do we fully realize the equality of men and women in our societies?
What is really important in the conversation about gender equality is for men and women to be included in it. I think that sometimes what we see is, because we focus so much on creating this gender equality in society, we tend to include women only. But as more and more as we include men, then this collective learning process just becomes stronger with the full participation of an entire community or society or an institution.
Shimona, it's so nice that you mentioned that, because a few years ago, the Bahá'í International community created a film called Glimpses into Gender Equality. And it was so nice to see younger men taking ownership of the role in the family and of childcare and being an equal partner with their wives. And I think I have a lot of hope in the younger generation as I see more and more young men stepping up to take responsibility and learn, and women allowing them to do so, because it also requires the understanding that we are all in this together. It's a common global enterprise, in a sense, to advance society.
I think sometimes what hinders the full participation of women and men is also this competition that exists. In certain parts of Africa, land isn't given to women because men fear that through agriculture, women will advance. Or in other parts, they're fearful of women taking up leadership positions because that means that they won't be able to. Mm-hmm. So when we think about the full participation of women and men, some of the assumptions have given risen to unfounded fears. And the more we engage in a learning process of how the qualities that we all possess, whether we're a woman or a man, how we can channel that into service to humanity and how to advance culture, then we will be able to learn more about what it means to have a gender equal society.
That is beautiful, Shimona, because you're speaking to also this idea of assumptions that we have. And I feel like in the society that we live in, there's certain assumptions that are made, for example, as to what power entails. And around this word power, we have certain qualities that are associated with it. So, for example, to be very assertive is seen as in a certain way. And women are often encouraged to adopt certain of those qualities that we think are or signal power. So how do we bring another set of qualities that are actually qualities that really help to transform society? And sometimes the qualities that we traditionally associate with this understanding of power are not the ones that allow us to transform society, but then others are. For example, the quality of humility is one that puts us in a posture of learning, and is that posture of learning that will help advance society. The quality of generosity, the quality of seeing capacity in others and maybe sort of stepping back to then quietly allow others to arise or accompany them without being sort of the one seen in the forefront.
And likewise, I think the assumption is that men need to be strong and, which has perpetuated some harmful tendencies of being in control and in charge and controlling women, and has also led to violence. And it's those harmful tendencies and assumptions which actually bring out a negative side, and whereas it should be perfectly normal for a man to be soft-spoken. And likewise, as you said, women in leadership have striven to demonstrate that, they are tough as any man, and that's the kind of pressure that society has placed on them. So in order to prove that they can succeed, they have to adopt some of the negative patterns that over the years, through the constructs of power and patriarchy that men have been assumed to have.
It also puts a lot of pressure on men, right? I mean, these types of constructs, these kind of assumptions, put a lot of pressures on men. And I think all of you have identified that learning attitude. This is really something that I'm pleased to see in the Arab world has become a prominent topic of conversation. And I think the process of starting this conversation, the process of engaging fully and genuinely in these types of conversation is what might get us hope to actually eventually create and imagine what a gender equal society would look like. And Bahá'í, you've had a lot of experience at the United Nations.
Yes, the Commission on the Status of Women has been deliberating on some of the normative standards that need to be put in place for governments to adopt laws and policies that will encourage the equality of women and men, encourage the advancement of women and girls. Education is one where we've seen great strides in many parts of the world. Of course, there are still large numbers of women who are not educated past primary school or not educated at all in some places. And again, there are economic reasons to that, but a lot of them are societal reasons as well, sometimes stemming from fear about the safety of women. Parents don't want to educate their girls because they have to go to school alone and they can be attacked on the way to school, sometimes because they feel that if they have a very educated daughter, she will not be compliant in her husband's home, and that will cause her problems. There are all kinds of reasons which are tied to social norms that prevent the advancement of women. So I think the educational process that we see in Baha'i communities, in some other faith communities that are consciously looking to promote an understanding of who we are, what is human nature. And in Baha'i communities around the world, we are seeing this. And when women and men sit together and read the Baha'i writings and consult about issues impacting their community, we see that there's a natural understanding of the complementarity of the women and men and how both contribute to the well-being of the larger society.
It's so interesting how the aspirations at the international level for gender equality are finding expression at the local level. And there, in some settings in Africa, there have been women's gatherings that have taken place. And I'm just thinking about a specific example in Zambia, where a gathering of some 120 women came together to discuss how to contribute to their community. And what was quite profound about this experience is that the men were the ones cooking and making sure that everything in the background was being taken care of so that the women could participate, which, if you understand the context in which that takes place, is quite profound. And it gives hope. It gives hope to a society where we are disgruntled with how the relationships between women and men are playing out. But some of these examples help us to realize that it's possible.
One of the things that I feel that the Baha'i community is trying to do is to learn about how to create this microcosm, if you will, of gender equal society. We're not there yet. In no way we can claim that we have managed to create a gender equal society, but we're trying to learn about it. And it manifests itself, for example, how do we elect our institutions, right? So the process of electing institutions, which is through a secret ballot, and also thinking about what are the qualities that we need in the institutions of our communities, rather than thinking about, a gender-biased perspective on that. And similarly, also, as you've identified, the process of consultation. In many of the Arab countries, the Baha'i community is learning about how men and women come together in these kinds of settings to learn about how to advance our spiritual and material needs in the communities. And I think this process of consultation, of respectful exchange of opinions and ideas, and really genuinely inquiring about where the truth is and collectively trying to reach decisions and identify common objectives and advance towards making them happen, is something that has become a pattern of community life in many of the Arab countries. And this is quite, for me, as somebody comes from Egypt, this is quite an encouraging advancement. So these processes of community building and consultation and recognizing the equality of men and women is something that the Baha'i communities in all the Arab countries have been learning about since the inception of the Baha'i faith for decades now. And not just in the Arab countries, but as you mentioned, also throughout the whole world.
But I also think for change to occur, that for really any issues that humanity is facing, these challenges can only be resolved if every single human being is allowed to express their full capacity. And I think right now we're sort of living in a society that has the idea that change occurs, for instance, when certain laws are adopted, and those laws are then sort of they allow for transformation to happen. And I think that we need to realize that for transformation to happen, a much deeper process needs to be set into motion. So if that understanding of as you said, Hatem, of that irreplaceable role of every human being in the transformation of society is not acquired, I think we'll have to realize that any kind of change is going to be very, very short-lived.
I think what you're saying, Rochelle, reminds me also of the relationship between the institutions, the community, and the individuals, and how strong that needs to be in order for change to happen. Because, yes, there are certain assumptions that at the institutional level, if there are policies, as you mentioned, that transformation will occur. But then that sometimes negates the role of the individual, or how to channel or to see them as protagonists. But then also, what is the role of the community in this? So I think the more that we try to understand the relationships that bind these three protagonists in society, the more we'll be able to learn about how to ensure the full participation of women and men. And I think in some settings at the grassroots level, we're seeing how institutions are learning from grassroots efforts to learn how to nurture the needs and aspirations of their people.
This idea of perception is also one that needs to be worked on. How do we perceive women? How do we perceive certain populations? And I think in the European context, when you're thinking about how, for example, a mother of several children that has just arrived from a country outside of Europe and that maybe is sort of financially struggling, and how the perception of that woman is, it is always one of being a victim. And I think this idea that we have of this particular woman needs to profoundly change, because what we're also seeing, for example, in the grassroots activities that are sort of hosted by the Bahá'í community alongside their neighbors and their friends, that same woman is a protagonist that is key in being able to ensure that transformation occurs at the local level. So when we're seeing a woman that maybe sort of on some levels, yes, she doesn't master the local language. Yes, she needs to work 2 jobs to sort of secure a certain income. But that woman is able to do all of that while tending to the needs of the family. And sometimes a lot of women do that on their own. And at the same time, they are the ones that are at the forefront, really in creating collective conversations as to the needs of a neighborhood. And not just to create these collective conversations, but really to then arise and take charge of the identifying of the solutions to those challenges. And I think if we're sort of able to have more and more actors see these women in the role that they're taking, then also, for example, municipal authorities will not just try and see how they can provide for these women, but they will actually see these women as agents of transformation. And they would want to learn alongside these women about how you can address certain challenges in society.
I think in Africa, we're actually seeing that a lot with women's gatherings that have been organized by primarily the Bahá'í community, where thousands of participants are attending, and not just women, but also men, to really understand, as you said, Rochelle, the reality of where they live and how to address those either challenges or opportunities that exist. Thinking not only of the older generation, but also the younger generation. And the Bahá'í community has certain educational endeavors that it pursues for children, for those who are young adolescents, for youth and adults, where everyone in the community is involved in this collective conversation, where spiritual principles and concepts are at the heart of it, not in the abstract, but in really trying to learn how to apply them to the social realities that they live in. And these gatherings have also motivated and influenced local institutional structures, where they're beginning to understand how they can better serve their people. So the more we are able to draw on the insights from not only these activities, but others that many around the world are trying to implement because of this desire to see gender equal societies, the more we'll be able to influence what is happening at the institutional level, at the level of the community, through maybe a process of learning.
Yeah, and it's these experiences that we at the Bahá'í International Community's UN office have been able to share at the international level, to learn from these examples, because even though we've seen advances in the laws and policies, etc., we are not seeing the kind of lasting, sustainable change as we are seeing through these gatherings that you've just described, because these are actually changing the hearts and minds of people, both women and men. We have to have some kind of system in place where we are creating lasting change, so that those pushbacks that are happening, that we are seeing around the world, will not happen, because this is a natural process. Of course, it's a very slow process, it's an organic process, but it's really trying to change the way we are wired to think about each other as women and men working alongside. And our roles, we are not promoting sameness. It's not that men and women have to be exactly the same and do the same things and have the same qualities. But with our beautiful diversity, we are learning how to complement each other to have strong communities and strong families, and raise a new generation of women and men who have a positive understanding of who they are, what human nature is, and what it is to be a man or a woman in society, and contribute to the advancement of the society in which they live.
And as the body of humanity is advancing, definitely we need to learn about how the interdependence and complementarity between the qualities of men and women can also support the advancement of society. I've had the great fortune of participating in some of these spaces that you mentioned, dear Bonnie, which was in the shape of the Commission on Status of Women, which is the annual conference that takes place at the United Nations and really starts to unpack some of the issues that are holding humanity back from recognizing and advancing the gender equal society. And this year, there's this conversation, of course, around how gender equality is a prerequisite for realizing peace, both at the level of social cohesion, but also with international relations. And this is going to be a very interesting topic of learning.
Yes, and this year we are going to commemorate 30 years since the Beijing conference. And at the Beijing conference, there was 600 women and men from around the world that went to Beijing and participated alongside the thousands of other women and some men who were there. And the Beijing conference was the fourth World Conference on Women. Before that, there was one in Nairobi, in Copenhagen, and in Mexico City. And the Bahá'í International Community actively participated in all those conferences, took leadership roles, and we continue to contribute to the discourse at the global level. It's so good to see that, Bahá'í communities around the world are committed to this ideal of realizing a gender equal society, as you said. Since the inception of the UN, we've been promoting this concept. And in fact, you know, in the over 170 years of the Baha'i faith, Baha'i communities have been learning how to put into practice this principle, which is at the core, one of the basic tenets of our faith is the equality of women and men. But it hasn't been easy. It's taken a long time, and we are still learning as to how to establish an equal society and one in which women and men are working equally to advance.
You've been listening to In Conversation, a podcast series from the Bahá'í World News Service. For more podcasts and stories, visit news.baha'i.org.